I had always been a night owl, so driving through the night as a trucker didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude of the highway, the distant hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the tires on the road. There was something peaceful about it, something that made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. But that night, the peace turned into a nightmare I still can't shake, one that haunts me whenever I close my eyes. It started around 2 a.m. I was barreling down a desolate stretch of highway in Nevada, miles of open road stretching endlessly into the darkness. The stars above twinkled faintly, the only light aside from my headlights piercing the pitch-black void ahead. The night felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like the universe is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired eyes. There, on the side of the road, stood a hitchhiker, her thumb outstretched. I squinted, trying to make sense of the figure. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this ungodly hour? Hitchhikers weren't exactly common on this stretch of highway. In fact, I hadn't seen a single soul for hours. Yet, there she was. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. A woman, maybe in her mid-30s, dressed in a tattered white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze. Her hair hung limply over her shoulders, matted and dirty. There was something wrong with the way she stood, so still, so expectant. Her pale face was illuminated by the glow of my headlights, and the closer I got, the more unsettled I became. She looked sick, almost ghostly, her skin ashen and her eyes hollow, as if she hadn't seen daylight in weeks. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to keep my foot on the gas, to not get involved, but something about her drew me in, a strange, unexplainable pull. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to bore into me, desperate and pleading. Against every instinct I had, I slowed down and pulled over. The woman didn't say a word as she climbed into the passenger seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost robotic. She sat down without so much as a glance in my direction, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just tired or traumatized. People react to things in different ways, I told myself. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the thick, uncomfortable silence. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken. Her silence was unnerving, but I figured maybe she'd been through something bad. I'd heard stories of people hitchhiking to escape dangerous situations. I didn't want to press her. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the soft purr of the engine and the tires on the road. But the longer we drove, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't help but sneak glances at her. There was something wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and there was a faint smell in the air, something sour and rotten. At first I thought it was just the staleness of the truck after hours on the road, but the smell got stronger, like decay. As the minutes ticked by, the air in the cab felt heavier, thicker, as if the darkness outside was seeping in, suffocating us. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. I could feel her presence next to me, cold and unnatural, like the air around her had dropped a few degrees. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get out, to stop the truck and leave her there. But I didn't. I couldn't. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her head turning slowly to face me. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. "No," I lied, my voice sounding too thin, too fragile in the suffocating darkness. She smiled then, a slow, eerie grin that spread across her face like something unnatural. "You should," she whispered, her voice lingering in the air long after the words had left her lips. That's when everything went wrong. The temperature in the truck plummeted, the warmth I'd felt earlier vanishing in an instant. My breath misted in front of me, and the radio, which had been silent the entire trip, crackled to life. Static filled the airwaves, but beneath it, I could hear faint voices, whispers. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded like people were talking, but their words were garbled, like they were coming from somewhere far away. Or maybe from somewhere else entirely. The headlights flickered, casting the highway in erratic flashes of light and shadow, and then the road ahead seemed to warp, stretching out endlessly like a tunnel with no end. Panic gripped me as I realized I couldn't tell if I was still moving forward or if I was stuck in place, driving nowhere. I stole a glance at the woman, and my blood ran cold. She wasn't sitting in the seat anymore. Instead, she was hovering above it, her body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, her limbs bent at impossible angles, and her face. God, her face. It was no longer human. Her eyes had turned pitch black, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The smell of decay filled the cab, overwhelming, suffocating. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt with a violent jerk. The woman let out a sound, a high-pitched, otherworldly scream that reverberated through the air, vibrating my bones. I threw the door open and stumbled out, my heart racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. When I turned back, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the smell of decay lingering like a ghostly reminder of her presence. I stood there, trembling, staring at the empty cab, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and gunned the engine, speeding off into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. I checked the passenger seat constantly, expecting her to reappear at any moment. I haven't driven down that stretch of highway since, but even now, whenever I'm alone on the road late at night, I can feel her presence. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet and the static hums through the radio, I hear her voice, soft, almost gentle, whispering just beneath the surface. You should.
My route often took me through some pretty desolate areas, long stretches of lonely highway where the only company I had was the hum of my engine and the distant stars overhead. It wasn't unusual for me to go hours without seeing another vehicle, and I was used to the isolation. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it most of the time, but none of those experiences prepared me for this one stretch of highway in the Midwest, a route I would come to dread and avoid at all costs. The landscape was unforgiving, flat, endless fields stretching out on either side of the road as far as the eye could see. Not a single tree or building in sight, just an ocean of darkness broken only by the faint glow of the moon. I had been driving for hours, pushing through the night, and the isolation was beginning to get to me. There wasn't even the occasional farmhouse light or the flicker of a town on the horizon to break the monotony. Just me, my truck, and the void. As the hours ticked by, I felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in. My eyes were getting heavy, and my mind wandered, dipping in and out of focus as the miles slipped away beneath my tires. I knew I needed to stop soon, to rest and recharge before I made a mistake on the road. But there were no gas stations or truck stops in sight. Nothing but darkness stretching ahead. That's when I finally saw the sign. A rest stop, 5 miles ahead. Relief flooded through me. It wasn't much, just one of those old, forgotten places that seemed to have been left behind by time. But it was better than nothing. I could at least stretch my legs, maybe catch a few hours of sleep in the cab before continuing on. As the miles dwindled, I imagined the cool night air, the stiffness leaving my body as I stepped out to breathe in the stillness. The rest stop came into view, an isolated patch of cracked pavement with a couple of picnic tables and a small cinder-block restroom building. It was the kind of place that had probably seen a lot of use in the 1970s, but had since been abandoned by most travelers, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. The single light above the restroom door flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the lot. I pulled my truck into one of the spaces, the engine rumbling softly as I sat there for a moment, taking in the desolate scene. The place was completely deserted. No surprise there. It was miles from anywhere, and no sane person would choose to stop here in the dead of night. But I had little choice, and despite the growing unease that settled in my gut, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the cab. The silence hit me immediately. There were no sounds, no crickets, no wind, no distant cars. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow everything around me. I shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to fatigue. I'd been on the road for almost 12 hours straight, and I was probably just paranoid, As I stretched my legs, I debated whether I should use the restroom, but something about the building gave me the creeps. It was old and crumbling, with the flickering light barely illuminating the entrance. The shadows seemed too deep, too thick, as if they were hiding something. I decided to hold it and just sleep in the truck. But as I turned back toward my rig, something caught my eye. Standing just beyond the edge of the dim light was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in ragged clothes. He was standing still, half shrouded in darkness, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I thought maybe he was another traveler who had pulled in after me. But there were no other vehicles, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky despite my attempt to sound casual. "You need something?" No response. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just stood there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Something was very, very wrong. I could feel it in the air, thick, heavy, suffocating. The man's presence felt unnatural, like he wasn't really there, but somehow more real than anything else around me. I backed up slowly, my eyes locked on the figure as I moved toward my truck. He still didn't move, but I could feel his gaze burning into me, like he was willing me to come closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and my instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there. Whatever this was, I didn't want to find out. I jumped into the cab, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I started the engine, and as the headlights flicked on, they illuminated the spot where the man had been standing. But he was gone. My blood ran cold. He had vanished, disappeared into the darkness without a sound. I scanned the rest stop, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't wait around to find out if he would come back. I threw the truck into gear and tore out of there, the tires screeching against the pavement as I sped back onto the highway. My heart was still racing, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins made it hard to focus. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the rest stop, watching me as I disappeared into the night. He wasn't there. But the feeling of dread followed me. It clung to me like a shadow, heavy and suffocating, as if the darkness itself was alive and watching. The farther I drove, the more intense it became, until I felt like I was being crushed under its weight. The night seemed to press in on me from all sides, the road ahead swallowed by a blackness that felt more like a presence than an absence. Then, I saw it. In the mirrors, just barely visible in the glow of my taillights, was the figure. He was standing in the middle of the road, impossibly far from where I had last seen him. But there he was, smaller and smaller as I sped away, but still there. My heart skipped a beat. He couldn't have followed me. There was no way. But there he was, standing motionless in the middle of the road, like a dark silhouette against the night. And somehow, I knew he was still watching me. I floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring as it picked up speed. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, and my eyes flicked constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. But no matter how fast I drove, the sense that I was being followed never left. It was like he was always just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the headlights, waiting for me to stop. I didn't stop again that night. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and my body trembling. I had driven straight through, too terrified to pull over. When I finally saw a truck stop up ahead, I pulled in and parked, my body sagging with relief. The sunlight felt like a shield, a barrier between me and the oppressive darkness I had escaped. But even then, as I sat there in the cab, staring out at the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking in the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing just beyond the edge of the light waiting for me. He wasn't there. But I knew he was out there somewhere, waiting. I still drive that route sometimes, but I've never stopped at that rest stop again. I avoid it like the plague. and I've even started planning my trips so that I don't have to drive at night. But no matter how much I try to put it behind me, I can't escape the memory of that night. And every now and then, when I'm out on those lonely highways, I feel it again, that sense of being watched. And when I look in the rearview mirror, I swear I see a figure, standing just beyond the light, too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel.
Long hauls were my bread and butter, and I had driven through some of the loneliest, most remote parts of the country. Highways that stretched on endlessly, winding through desolate deserts, vast forests, and barren plains with no towns or signs of life in sight for hundreds of miles. These roads became my second home. I thought I had seen it all: storms, empty landscapes that stretched out like an ocean, and the occasional eerie, abandoned gas station. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the trip through Wyoming. That stretch of road would forever haunt me. It was nearing midnight, and the sky was a pitch-black canvas, dotted only by a few faint stars. My rig was the only thing moving for miles, the headlights carving a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness. The truck's engine hummed beneath me, steady, constant, and the tires thrummed rhythmically against the pavement. I found that hum comforting. It drowned out the loneliness of these drives, made the endless silence bearable. But as I cruised along that narrow two-lane highway, surrounded by nothing but open plains and the occasional distant silhouette of mountains, something felt different. The road was empty, not another vehicle in sight. No headlights in the distance, no taillights fading ahead. Just me and the night. I had been on the road for hours, and my mind had settled into that familiar, almost meditative state that long-haul drivers know all too well, half focused on the road, half lost in thought. But out of nowhere, a sudden feeling washed over me, sharp and cold. I felt as if I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off as nerves. I'd been through worse stretches of road, places that felt even more isolated than this. But the sensation grew stronger, prickling at the back of my neck. My hands tightened on the wheel as I fought the urge to look in the rearview mirror. Something told me I wouldn't like what I'd see. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I flicked my eyes up to the mirror, expecting to see nothing but empty road behind me. But there, in the red glow of my taillights, stood a man. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, standing dead center in the middle of the road, motionless. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at him, illuminated by the faint light of my truck, a shadowy figure that hadn't been there moments before. For a split second, I thought maybe he was a stranded motorist, someone who needed help. It was possible, though unlikely, given where I was. But the longer I looked at him, the more I realized something was off. He wasn't moving, not waving me down, not signaling for help, just standing there, as still as a statue. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and there was no sign of a broken-down car or any reason for him to be out there on this desolate stretch of highway. A cold chill crept up my spine, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tore my eyes away from the mirror, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. My heart was still pounding, but I tried to calm myself. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. After all, how could he have gotten there without me seeing him approach? But the feeling of being watched never left me. In fact, it intensified. I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the mirror again, half expecting to see him gone. But there he was, still standing in the middle of the road, still watching me. It didn't matter how far I drove or how fast I went. He didn't move. His figure remained the same size in the mirror, as if he was frozen in place, locked in that same eerie position. By the time an hour had passed, the tension in my chest was unbearable. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly, and my breath came in shallow, uneasy gulps. I kept telling myself to stop thinking about it, to let it go, but my mind wouldn't cooperate. It was like he had etched himself into my brain, a shadow that I couldn't shake. Finally, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. The thought of stopping, even for a moment, felt like relief. I needed to clear my head, stretch my legs, and convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe I was overtired, pushing myself too hard. The rest stop was deserted when I pulled in. A single flickering street lamp cast long shadows over the cracked pavement, and the building itself looked run down, as if no one had bothered to maintain it in years. I parked my rig and sat there for a moment, the engine idling softly as I stared out at the empty lot. The night felt unnaturally still, like the air itself was holding its breath. With a sigh, I turned off the engine and climbed out of the cab. The cold night air hit me like a slap, refreshing but eerie in its stillness. As I stretched my legs and walked around to check the tires, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. But they were there, unmistakable, growing closer. My blood ran cold as I turned, fully expecting to see someone, a fellow trucker, a late-night traveler. But the lot was empty. No one was there. My heart was pounding now, thudding in my ears as I stood frozen in place, scanning the lot for any sign of movement. But it was dead quiet, the only sound the gentle wind whispering through the empty plains. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been driving too long. I was tired, paranoid. But then, I saw him again. At the edge of the lot, near the entrance to the rest stop, stood the man from the road. He was closer now, much closer than he had been before, but still just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. His silhouette was eerily still, like a dark shadow cut from the night. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt an icy tendril of fear creep through my veins. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in some sort of silent standoff. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the next move, daring me to come closer, to acknowledge him. I didn't. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the truck, my legs pumping furiously beneath me. My boots barely touched the ground as I sprinted back to the cab, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't dare risk it. All I could think about was getting back into the truck, locking the doors, and getting the hell out of there. Once I was safely inside, I slammed the doors shut and fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I started the engine, threw the truck into gear, and peeled out of the rest stop as fast as I could. My heart was still racing, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I sped down the highway, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. But the nightmare wasn't over. Even as I drove, the unease never left me. No matter how fast I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that rest stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, and there he was, standing by the side of the road, his figure barely illuminated by the glow of my taillights. Sometimes he was ahead of me, standing in the distance, waiting, always waiting. I never saw his face clearly, but the glimpses I caught sent shivers down my spine. His eyes, they weren't right. They were hollow, dark, like empty pits that swallowed the light around them. His body moved in a way that wasn't natural, like he was bound by some otherworldly force, not the rules of the physical world. By the time the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I was a wreck. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I hadn't stopped driving, hadn't dared to pull over for the rest of the night. The exhaustion weighed heavy on my bones, but the fear kept me going. The man had vanished with the dawn, but his presence still clung to me like a shadow. When I finally pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town, I collapsed in the cab, shaking and exhausted. I told myself it was over, that I was safe now, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. He was still out there, waiting, watching. I never spoke of what happened to anyone, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Every time I get behind the wheel, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there again, waiting for me. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the darkness presses in, I feel his eyes on me, watching, always watching.